Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our presentation today on growth scale values, a step toward improving precision in research. My name is Dr. Lynsey Psimas, and I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Paul Williams. I'm the director of Pearson Pharma Services, and I'm a licensed psychologist and have experience as a clinician and a professor, and I've worked with Pearson Clinical Assessments for almost 10 years.
I'm Dr. Paul Williams. I'm an account manager working with Lynsey on the pharmaceutical team here at Pearson. I've been with Pearson about 21 years, most of that working in our product development team, working on the development of such tests as the Bailey-3, the Wechsler scales, and authoring a few other scales along the way. Now I'm part of the pharma team. I do consulting on assessments and also help with account management.
Thanks, Paul. Paul and I are going to be presenting on GSVs today. This talk is going to be setting the stage for how growth scale values can be used in research and clinical trials. We'll go through a high-level overview of the conceptual basis of GSVs and a description of some of their characteristics as well. We'll do some examples. This disclosure right here, Paul and I do work for Pearson, and we are salaried employees. So what are growth scale values? Growth scale values, or GSVs, are a linear transformation of raw scores. So you can compare GSVs over multiple occasions to determine whether an examinee's skill level has changed relative to their prior performance. So you can compare GSVs over the same test, but you can't compare them between tests. These are a type of score, like a raw score, that represents the absolute performance on a test. So as an example, the number of questions that are answered correctly. These are not normative scores, so they do not tell how this person is performing against their same aged peers. These are specially measured, specially designed to measure change over time, and their numerical values don't have any meaning on their own. You can see on this slide that we have an example of GSVs from the Bailey Scales of Infant and Toddler Development 3rd edition. So GSVs can typically be found within a manual. In this case, it's in Appendix B. So here are some examples of tests with growth scale values. So this metric has been used for over 50 years. So while they're increasing in the research that's out there, they're not a new type of metric. They're included on many well-known tests like the Bailey, the DOS, the KTEA, the PPVT, and the Wyatt. This scale was originally used under the name of the W scale, which came from the Woodcock-Johnson psychoeducational battery. So it could be called a few different things like ability score, growth score, change sensitive score, or like I said, the W score. And I'm going to actually hand this over to Paul now to review how GSVs are derived.
Thanks, Lynsey. Deriving GSV scale values, this is a linear transformation process using the Roche ability scale. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that is and what it entails there a little bit later. This is the calibration process that makes raw scores into an equal interval scale. It's been used to measure growth over time within an individual, as Lynsey mentioned. The nice thing about this, they are flexible with the type or mode of scoring. They can be used with dichotomous scores or polytomous scores, such as Likert scales. GSV is made up of two important aspects. They are part of a very simple version of the IRT, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're easy to understand. Unless you really are knowledgeable in psychometrics, you would know the formulas that are behind it. But basically put, it is looking at the item difficulty, so a very important characteristic of each item, and the ability level of the person who can pass that test. Now, this is a large sample of persons to be able to derive these, meaning that the samples for generating GSVs are quite expensive, but they are generally developed during the standardization of a given test anyway. So therefore, it's an additional psychometric process that can be added that it gives us an additional value and score to use, especially for measuring change over time. So you take these two numerical values of ability along with the difficulty, and you get an expected item score for a given person taking that item. So let's look at a unit of ability. A unit of ability is the change in ability that raises the probability of passing an item from 50% to 73%. So that 23% of change, it's taken from one ability to another. Now that sounds like a lot of change, but when you put it on a large linear scale with a lot of items, those are small incremental changes in reality. But the Roche model takes those and converts them into this interval scale, which allows for more precise measurement across time. So this is looking at one item. So let's call it item N. So a person with ability level of 2 has a 50% chance of passing that item. To go to the next level, at level 3, an individual at an ability of 3 would have a 73% chance of passing that item. So they have grown in 23% increments. So this is a constant across the scale. Now, the difficulty of an item, let's look at a more practical approach to understanding how the difficulty can also be seen in the item itself. And so if you look at a very low difficulty or easy item on the Bailey, regards an object for 5 seconds. So this is a very low cognitive developmental ability of just being able to attend to an object. They can see it, they can recognize it as something that's interesting, and I'm paying attention to it. That's a very low ability. Step up a little bit more in ability, plays with a string. Now I'm not just attending to it, I'm actually interacting with it. That's a higher cognitive level. Now, attending to a story. So now they're listening to your voice, which children developmentally normally become very attracted to voices and faces. And so they attend to the story. It's a little higher cognitive level when you get to that developmental stage. And then step a little further up in difficulty, picks a shape that is different. We show them a novel shape at first. They habituate to it. Then we show them another novel object, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, I'm going to pay attention to that. So that's a little bit higher cognitive level. So you can see the probability of answering that requires a higher level of ability. So basically, that's what the Roche model is doing with item difficulties. So this is the frequency of distribution of item difficulties across the cognitive scale of the Bailey 3. As you can see, there's a lot more items piling up toward the end of the scale. That's because they're easy to develop up here. And so you get very specific change across these items because there's a lot of items filling up every gap. When you get down to the lower end of the scale, which is probably the most important part for pharmaceutical research, because oftentimes you're working with children that are very low functioning and struggling. But it's very difficult, take it from experience, very difficult to develop items at this level, because it's just every time you try to develop a new item, it either jumps in too much ability or it stays at the same ability, so you're measuring nothing. And so that you get very difficult to measure these children at the lower end. We're still working on ways to do that, and GSV really does help precision even at that level, but it still needs development ways we can figure that out even better.
All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about thanks for that, Paul, how GSVs compare to other metrics that we see frequently used in clinical trials. So first, GSVs and raw scores. We see raw scores used a lot in clinical trials, but raw scores are not on an equal interval scale, like Paul was talking about. So a given difference in raw score points doesn't have the same meaning at different score levels. Raw scores exhibit a great deal of variability, which might be attractive from a statistical perspective, but they're not measured in an interval scale. So these changes at different levels are not comparable between different ages or different ability levels. So GSVs, they have a known SEM for each score, and they have a group SEM based on raw scores have a group SEM based on the overall sample.
So to look at that interval nature of the GSV and why this is so important and where we're gaining that little bit of precision, which any little bit of precision gained is worth it. So if you look at the left side, the raw scores on this side, you look at a change of 2 at the low level and compare it to a change of 2 at the higher level, because like Lynsey said, they're not an interval on basis on the raw scores. You get a smaller change in GSV at the low end, but a larger change in the upper end, meaning that same change in ability. Now you've got that little bit of imprecision. If you have data that involves people at the low and the middle and the high range, there's that little bit of imprecision there. However, on the GSV, you see that the change of 2 at the same level is the exact same amount of change in GSV at the whole scale range. So therefore, you have that equal interval range. And that means precision gained.
So GSV and age equivalence, we just talked about raw scores. Now we're talking about GSV and age equivalence. So age equivalents have really been a standard metric used in research. While these are familiar and they're easy for parents and clinicians to interpret, they are not as precise because they do not have standard deviations, they do not have the SEMs, and they don't have equal intervals between scores. So age equivalents can qualitatively change in a person's performance, but quantitatively, they're just not as precise. So next, we're going to talk about GSVs and norm reference scores. So we know that we use norm reference scores a lot for documenting diagnoses and treatment planning and disabilities, but they really don't have the same ability to measure growth because GSVs reflect absolute growth rather than a relative level of performance like norms do, norm reference scores. So GSVs are more sensitive to change within an individual than norm reference scores are. And they really just, normative data just can't measure change over time accurately and consistently. It just can't measure with confidence without a better understanding and deeper dive into what actually happened. It doesn't tell you about increases, declines, and other meaningful change. And I'll give some examples of this in a few slides.
So this increasing the effective range of any measurement within a clinical trial is also very valuable. One of the worst things that can happen is you have a child that ages out of a test and can no longer be a member because they aged out. And that's lost data, that's lost time, that's lost money, and lost resources. So in expanding that range of effectiveness is very important. So let's unpack this table here and look at what that means across the different score types. So over here we have the score types, and we're going to talk about the normative scores first. And using the Bailey 3 as an example, the cognitive scale, the Bailey goes from 0 to 42 months for chronological age. So chronological age and developmental age are two very different things. This is static, it's a number. How old's the child? Development, that's where they are. Where have they grown? We can think of development also as ability. It's the same thing, synonymous. So for the range gets cut off at 42. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So therefore the tables stop there. So you can't go any further. There's no lookup table to go beyond 42 months. As far as developmental age, however, and let's look at the highest age range of 42 months. That's the ceiling for the Bailey norms. You can have a developmental age from 16 to 66 months. And you're probably thinking, now how is that possible? Now, this is a 42-month-old who's developmentally operating at a 66-month-old. So if you think of it that way, but they're still a 42-month-old because you can only look up, that's the oldest age you can look up, but that's the range of effective measurement. If we go to age equivalence doesn't care about chronological age at all. It doesn't matter. It can be any chronological age. However, your developmental age still has to be within 0 and 42 because you're still stuck to the data that's available for the ages in the sample. GSV and raw scores share the same kind of characteristics in this manner as far as chronological age and developmental age. They really don't mind what chronological age the individual's at. Their developmental age, however, like I said, can be between 0 to 66 months. So in using these two scores, you can effectively allow a child to be in your study up to 66 months, so less likely to age out, which is a very important part of the process. So let's talk about just real quick about how do we set that 42 months? Well, this is a bell-shaped curve we're all familiar with, and we have a big population in here that gives us this data that basically says, okay, here's our mean. Here's 3 or 4 standard deviations above, 3 to 4 standard deviations below. Now, we want to try to measure this range as much as possible with a given test. So therefore, we have a large sample. We always collect the over 42-month-olds. We have that data, but we want to find where is the mean age that puts them right in the middle of the bell curve. That way, that very, very highly developed, functioning child at 42 months, we can measure them all the way up to about 3 standard deviations above the mean. And that is very valuable when it comes to not aging out of an assessment. But you gain that range because of those items of difficulty still keep going. They don't stop at the mean. So there's a lot more items that can test those subjects. I overlaid the distribution of difficulties at the bottom just to show kind of where they fall and also demonstrate why it's very hard for us to measure with any precision those children that fall down at the end. Again, those items are just very difficult to write. So this is a look at that same concept of that expanding that range of testing because the GSVs remain rather small. So if we look at this table, we look at the mean scores going all the way up to about 68 months, 66 months, and the mean being here, the 42, you can see that the SEM range for the GSVs remains quite small as you go through. Now, right about here, we're borderline on 3 standard deviations above the mean. At this point, when you get past this, these start flaring out significantly because, again, there's not a lot of items that are way up there that difficult, and so it just starts to fan out. So we stop it where the SEMs remain reasonable, and that is indicated here.
Thanks, Paul, for that. I'm going to go into some examples now of how GSV performance compares to norm reference scaled scores in a hypothetical scenario. So I'll provide some examples of what the same individual taking the same test, what their score, how this variability might look between a GSV and a scaled score, and why it's important to really consider the type of score that you're using when you're measuring change. So in this example, you can see in the graph that the GSV score is located in the top row and the scaled score is located right underneath. So in this scenario, the GSV shows improvement. It goes from 498 to 516, and the scaled score is also showing improvement. So in this scenario, we have the GSV score that has improved relative to past personal performance. The scaled score shows that the person is improving at a rate faster than their peers. So again, because that norm reference score is comparing peers, we're saying, okay, this person is actually not only showing skill improvement on their own, but they're also improving more quickly than their peers are. So in the second example, you'll see on the next slide, this is an example where both the GSV and the scaled score decline. So when your GSV, again, that individual performance declines, it means that the student perhaps hasn't gained any skills. There's no improvement in their skill, knowledge, or proficiency. They haven't gained any new skills. The scaled score shows that they are declining at a rate relative to how their peers are performing. So their skills may be, their peers may be improving at a rate faster, and their actual rate of improvement is slower than peers. In the third example, if we show the GSV has showed improvement and the scaled score, though, has stayed the same, then we're showing, again, that the individual skills have improved according to the GSV. But for the scaled score, they're improving at the same rate as their same aged peers. So ultimately, this person knows more than they did previously, and they're improving at a rate consistent with their peers. And in the last example, we can see, okay, so the GSV remains the same, but the scaled score decreases. The GSV is telling us that their level of knowledge, what they know, their skills are the same, but that with the scaled score, they're learning at a rate slower than peers. So you can see how even though these two different scores are being used, they don't tell the same story. And a GSV can better track how that individual's absolute performance is improving or decreasing without being compared to how other children the same age are performing in the normative sample.
So our key message here we'd like you to take from this is that Dorsal values are designed to measure change over time and within an individual. That's their specific and only purpose. GSVs support that out of level testing like we talked about, which is very important when you're talking about children aging out or even qualifying for being in a study. See, the interval nature of GSVs improves the precision. We saw how you get the same amount of change over the whole scale rather than having different changes because of where they are in the on the scale. So the primary advantages of raw scores and age equivalence is that linear relationship to underlying ability. The score-specific SEMs, your psychometricians are going to love you because they would love to have a score-specific SEM because it's going to make their measurement and their data more precise. And change can be interpreted on the task levels we saw in those items. You can actually have qualitative results that show that, yeah, this is the ability level. And here's an example if they were at the beginning of this step. Now look at what they can do at the end of the study. That's pretty influential information. Even though they're going to want to see statistical information, it's always also good to show how they actually have performance differences.
So on this slide, we just included some research articles where GSVs are used in this research. Might be helpful to review, see how the GSVs are applied. And then on the next art page, we have some references just that we used for some of the information that we spoke about today. You can pause the recording if you need to and write any of this information down. And then the last thing I'm going to do here is review some of Pearson's additional capabilities. So here on our pharma team at Pearson, clinical outcome assessments. So we have a library of hundreds of assessments with many translations. All of our translations are done with the linguistic validation and supreme methodology that is the standard. They all come with a certificate of translation. We do offer rater training as well on each of our tests. We offer a COA migration and screenshot review to streamline your experience with Pearson and ensure your tests remain valid when they're delivered electronically. And then lastly, we have a team of clinical experts that are available for scientific consultation for things like GSVs that we talked about today, clinical outcome assessment selection, or data analysis. And we just have a whole team of dedicated account managers who are ready to assist with COA selection and help you through the licensing process. So if you have any additional questions, we have our landing page on pearsonassessments.com/pharma listed here on the slide. And Paul and I have also included our personal email addresses. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, and we will be in touch with you. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation today. Thank you.